The date is June 28, 1914. A sunny summer morning in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie are riding through the streets in an open-top car, waving to crowds. In less than an hour, they will both be dead, and the world will never be the same again. What followed was not just a war. It was the systematic destruction of an entire generation. A conflict so brutal, so mechanized, so utterly senseless that it would claim over 20 million lives and leave the survivors wondering if humanity itself had gone mad. This is the story of World War I, the war that shattered empires, redrew the map of the world, and introduced horrors that still haunt us today. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. This wasn't a war that had to happen. It was a war that almost everyone stumbled into, driven by pride, miscalculation, and a catastrophic failure of imagination. And once it started, no one could stop it. Let me take you back to that summer day in 1914. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, had already failed once that morning. His group had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and exploded under the wrong vehicle. The assassination attempt seemed over. The Archduke was furious but alive. He decided to visit the wounded from the bombing at the hospital. But then something almost absurdly improbable happened. The driver took a wrong turn. As he tried to reverse, the car stalled directly in front of a cafe where Princip was standing, contemplating his failure. History had handed him a second chance. He pulled out his pistol and fired twice. Both the Archduke and his wife were hit. Within the hour, they were dead. Now, you might think, how does one assassination lead to a war that kills 20 million people? The answer lies in a web of alliances so complicated, so interlocking, that Europe had essentially turned itself into a loaded gun, just waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination. They wanted revenge, wanted to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. But Russia had promised to protect Serbia. Germany had promised to support Austria-Hungary. France was allied with Russia. Britain had treaties with France and Belgium. It was like a row of dominoes, and once the first one fell, there was no stopping the cascade. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its army. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. To attack France, Germany invaded neutral Belgium. This brought Britain into the war. Within weeks, all the major powers of Europe were at war, and they all thought it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. The generals who planned this war were living in the past. They had studied the wars of the 1800s, wars of movement and cavalry charges, wars where battles were won by courage and elan. What they didn't understand was that technology had changed everything. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute. Artillery could kill men from miles away. Barbed wire could stop any cavalry charge dead in its tracks. The result was carnage on a scale never before seen in human history. Let me describe what happened on the Western Front, because this is where the true horror of World War I unfolded. After the initial German advance was stopped at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, both sides dug in. They created trenches, defensive lines that would eventually stretch 475 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. And for the next 4 years, millions of men would live and die in these trenches, fighting over yards of mud. Imagine this. You're a soldier, maybe 18 or 19 years old. You've been told this war will be glorious, that you'll be a hero. Instead, you find yourself standing in a trench, a narrow ditch carved into the earth. The walls are supported by rotting wood and sandbags. The bottom is a soup of mud, water, human waste, and sometimes pieces of the dead from previous battles. Rats, some as big as cats, feast on corpses and spread disease. The stench is unbearable, a mixture of death, decay, latrines, and unwashed men. You haven't had a proper wash in weeks. Your uniform is caked in mud. Your feet are constantly wet, and you can feel the first signs of trench foot, a condition where the flesh literally rots off your bones. Lice crawl through your hair and clothing, biting constantly, driving men to the edge of madness. But the worst part, the waiting. You stand there hour after hour, day after day, knowing that at any moment a sniper's bullet could take your head off, or an artillery shell could land directly in your trench, obliterating you and everyone around you. The shelling never stops. The ground shakes constantly. Men break down, unable to cope with the psychological torture. They called it shell shock. Today we'd call it PTSD, but back then, if you couldn't handle it, you were considered a coward. And then comes the order you've been dreading. Tomorrow, we go over the top. Picture this scene because it happened hundreds of times during the war. Officers blow whistles at dawn. You climb the ladder out of your trench. You and thousands of other men begin walking, not running, walking across no man's land, the devastated space between the trenches. Your officers have told you the week-long artillery bombardment has destroyed the enemy's defenses. They're wrong. The moment you emerge from the trench, the machine guns open up. The sound is like tearing fabric, but amplified 1,000 times. Men fall around you, cut down in waves. You keep walking because those are your orders. Walk, don't run, keep formation. Your friends, men you've lived with in that trench for months, are being torn apart beside you. Some are hit and fall silently. Others scream, tangled in barbed wire, slowly dying as bullets continue to find them. If you're lucky, you make it to the enemy trench. Now comes hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, clubs, sharpened shovels. It's brutal, primal, nothing like the civilized warfare the generals imagined. And even if you capture that trench, you've gained maybe 100 yards of destroyed earth. Tomorrow or next week, you'll have to do it all again. This wasn't war as anyone had imagined it. This was industrial-scale slaughter. Let me tell you about the Battle of the Somme, because this single battle encapsulates everything that was wrong with World War I. It began on July 1, 1916. The British and French planned a massive offensive to break through German lines. They were confident. They had been shelling German positions for a week. Surely nothing could survive that bombardment. On the first day, 100,000 British soldiers went over the top. By nightfall, 60,000 were casualties. 20,000 were dead. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history. And the worst part, they had achieved almost nothing. The German defenses, dug deep underground, had survived the bombardment. The machine gunners had simply climbed up when the shelling stopped and mowed down the advancing British troops. The battle continued for 4.5 months. When it finally ended in November, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The Allies had advanced at most 6 miles. Do the math. That's roughly 166,666 casualties per mile gained. And in the grand scheme of the war, those 6 miles meant nothing. But it wasn't just the Western Front. World War I was truly global. In the East, Russia fought Germany and Austria-Hungary across vast expanses. At Tannenberg in 1914, the Germans destroyed an entire Russian army, killing or capturing 170,000 men. The Eastern Front was more mobile than the Western, but no less deadly. Russia would eventually lose over 3 million men in the war. In Italy, Italian and Austrian forces fought a series of 12 separate battles along the Isonzo River. These battles, fought in mountainous terrain, were just as futile and bloody as those in France. In one offensive, the Italians lost 300,000 men and gained almost nothing. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire fought the British and their allies. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, led Arab forces in a guerrilla war against the Ottomans. Meanwhile, at Gallipoli, Allied forces attempted to knock the Ottomans out of the war by invading through Turkey. It was a disaster. Thousands of Australian, New Zealand, British and French troops were slaughtered on the beaches and cliffs. The campaign failed completely. And then there were the new weapons, technology specifically designed to kill more efficiently. Poison gas was introduced in 1915. Chlorine gas at first, later replaced by the more deadly mustard gas. Imagine choking, drowning in your own fluids as your lungs fill with liquid. That's what gas did. Even if you survived, you might be blinded or suffer permanent lung damage. Both sides used it, and it became one of the most feared weapons of the war. Tanks appeared in 1916, lumbering metal beasts that could cross trenches and resist machine gun fire. Early versions were unreliable, often breaking down or getting stuck. But they represented the future of warfare, a mechanized future that would dominate the 20th century. Airplanes, barely a decade old when the war started, became weapons. At first, they were used for reconnaissance. Then pilots started bringing pistols and rifles to shoot at enemy planes. Soon, machine guns were mounted on aircraft. Dogfights became part of the war, with aces like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, becoming famous for their kills. But even in the sky, death was always close. Most pilots died young. Submarines, particularly German U-boats, turned the oceans into killing zones. They attacked merchant ships, trying to starve Britain into submission. In 1915, a U-boat sank the passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. This would eventually help draw the United States into the war. By 1917, the war had ground into a stalemate. Millions were dead, but neither side had achieved victory. Then two massive events changed everything. First, Russia collapsed. Years of military disasters, food shortages, and political unrest led to revolution. The Tsar was overthrown in February 1917. Later that year, the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power and promised peace. In March 1918, Russia signed a treaty with Germany and withdrew from the war. For Germany, this was huge. They could now move their troops from the Eastern Front to the West for one final offensive. But there was a problem. In April 1917, the United States had entered the war on the side of the Allies. The sinking of American ships by U-boats and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany tried to convince Mexico to attack the United States, had finally pushed America into the conflict. Fresh American troops and resources began flooding into Europe. Germany launched its spring offensive in March 1918, a desperate attempt to win the war before American forces arrived in full strength. Initially, it was successful. German forces advanced further than they had in years, but they couldn't sustain the momentum. The Allies held, then counterattacked. By August 1918, the tide had definitively turned. The 100 Days offensive saw Allied forces, now including substantial American troops, push the Germans back. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria surrendered in September, the Ottoman Empire in October, Austria-Hungary in early November. Inside Germany, there was revolution. The Kaiser abdicated. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., an armistice took effect. The guns finally fell silent. After 4 years, 3 months, and over 20 million dead, World War I was over. But the horror didn't end there. The war had unleashed forces that would shape the rest of the century. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, blamed Germany for the war and imposed crushing reparations. This humiliation and economic devastation would help create the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler and World War II. The Russian Revolution brought communism to power, leading to the Cold War and conflicts that lasted until 1991. The Ottoman Empire was carved up, creating unstable new nations in the Middle East. Borders drawn by European powers with no regard for ethnic or religious divisions would fuel conflicts that continue to this day. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist, replaced by smaller nations. Colonial empires began to crack as soldiers from India, Africa, and other colonies returned home questioning why they should be ruled by Europeans after fighting for them. Entire families were wiped out. A generation of young men was destroyed. In France, entire villages lost all their young men. Britain lost nearly 900,000 dead. Germany lost 2 million. Russia lost over 3 million. These weren't just statistics. Every number represented a person, a life, a family destroyed. The psychological impact was immense. Millions returned home with what we now recognize as PTSD. They had nightmares, couldn't adjust to civilian life, struggled with what they had seen and done. Society didn't understand. Many veterans felt abandoned, unable to share their experiences with people who couldn't comprehend the horror. The physical landscape of Europe was devastated. Huge swaths of France and Belgium were so torn up by shelling that they remained uninhabitable for years. Even today, over a century later, farmers in these regions regularly plow up unexploded shells and bombs. The French term is the iron harvest. Some of these munitions still contain poison gas. World War I shattered the old world. Before 1914, there was a sense of optimism, a belief in progress, in the essential goodness of Western civilization. The war destroyed that. How could you believe in progress when you'd seen industrial technology turn toward mass killing? How could you have faith in civilization after experiencing the trenches? The literature, art, and culture of the 1920s reflected this. The lost generation of writers, people like Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque, tried to capture the sense of disillusionment and trauma. Their works are filled with characters who can't find meaning, who struggle to reconcile their experiences with the world they returned to. And yet, the most tragic part of World War I is that it was preventable. At multiple points in July 1914, the crisis could have been diffused. Cooler heads could have prevailed. But nationalism, pride, fear, and miscalculation pushed Europe over the edge. Leaders convinced themselves that their alliances would deter war, when in fact those alliances guaranteed that any local conflict would become a world war. The generals convinced themselves that the war would be short, that offense would dominate, that morale and courage would overcome machine guns and artillery. They were wrong about everything. And by the time they realized their mistakes, millions were already dead, and the war had taken on a momentum of its own. No one knew how to stop it. This is the horrifying truth about World War I. It wasn't a war fought for survival like World War II. It wasn't a war with clear moral lines. It was a war that destroyed empires and killed millions, all because of pride, misunderstanding, and an inability to back down. In the end, everyone lost. Even the victors emerged broken, their societies traumatized, their economies ruined, their faith in progress shattered. World War I didn't solve anything. It created more problems than it solved. The war to end all wars instead planted the seeds for an even more destructive conflict just 2 decades later. It taught the world that modern technology could kill on an unprecedented scale. It showed that civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The men who fought in World War I were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, forced to endure horrors that no human should ever experience. They did their duty as they understood it, and they paid a terrible price. We remember World War I not because it was glorious, but because it was horrifying. We remember it so that we never forget the cost of miscalculation, the danger of nationalism unchecked, the horror of industrial warfare. We remember it because those millions who died deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, but as people who lived and loved and hoped before they were consumed by a war that should never have happened. This is Neural Battlefields, where we explore the conflicts that shaped our world. If this documentary has given you a new perspective on World War I, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and sharing it with others who want to understand history's most pivotal moments. Subscribe to join us as we continue uncovering the truth behind the battles that changed everything. Until next time, remember the past so we can build a better future.